Jim. In this video, I will show you a little bit about how to use basic photo editing tools to give your street photos that classic street photography look. If you haven't already spent some time getting familiar with the photo editing tools in your software, you might want to check out the video that I made that shows you the basic tools first, because I'm not going to explain how the tools work. I'm just going to show you how to apply them in this video. So if we do a search on street photography, just in Google, you'll see that street photography is pretty well evenly balanced between black and white and color. So we're going to cover both black and white and color looks in this video. So as we scroll through here, you'll see that whether it's in color or black and white, it tends to have a similar kind of look to it. And what I'm talking about today has to do with the way that light, shadows, uh, and the amount of color or gradation, grayscale, is treated. I'm going to flip over to this. I'm going to start with color. So here are, again, searching on color street photography. You'll see there's quite a bit of consistency in the style or the look of street photography in the color world. There's a photo down here a little ways that I want to show you. This one I would like to take a little, I've already copied it to my desktop and I'm going to open it in Photos so that we can kind of take a look at it. So looking at it in my Mac photo editor, let's take a look a little bit to see what we're seeing here. So the colors are very vivid, and you'll notice that the darks are quite dark. Those are the main criteria, or the main features or aspects of the street photography look. Let's go back. I want to open up this photo now. This is one of mine that I took in Tokyo back in 2009. And it's in an area called Omotesando. It's actually not far from the Christian Science Church there. And I like this photo because of the obvious connection between the man and the woman looking at each other. But what I really like about it is that this love in the background here, I didn't realize that was there until way later, after I was home and was looking through my photos, and I just thought, gee, that's a really interesting kind of dialogue going on here between the man and the woman looking at each other with love in the middle. So we're going to go into the edit mode and mess with this photo a little bit. We're going to use the adjustment tools. And we don't have to use a lot of fancy things to create that street photography look. Really, it's based on brightness and contrast, and then a little bit of saturation. So brightness has to do with making the overall image brighter, pretty self-evident. Contrast is about changing the relationship between the darks and the lights. Most of the street photography style is built on this idea of high contrast, and you'll see as I turn the contrast up, it starts to look more like the example that I'm trying to show here. Getting these darks very dark and the brights brighter makes these images much more striking. Just to show you what it does, if I turn the contrast down, the image starts to look flat and boring. So a lot of times the style that you're shooting, that you're trying to achieve with your photos, has a lot to do with how much of these effects you would apply. But I think you've seen in the examples in the Google searches that in the street photography style, the contrast is actually quite high. If you're looking for a fine art photo or something that might be a journalistic photo or editorial or fashion, you probably wouldn't want to go this high with the contrast, because what happens is as you increase the contrast, you'll notice that the detail in the dark parts will go away. If I have this set back at normal, let me revert to the original again. You can actually see the folds and wrinkles in the woman's pants. But if I turn the contrast up, her pants just become a solid black. So a lot of times, especially like in an art photography situation or journalism or editorial or fashion, if I was a fashion designer, I want to see the way the fabric drapes and falls. I would not be happy with the photograph with the contrast set that high. The other thing you'll notice is that, again, in terms of portrait and um, sometimes fashion, that contrast is going to take all the detail out of the woman's hair. So there's a point where it really makes a big difference what style you're going for. Street photography look is very, very aggressive look. High contrast, high brightness. And then the other thing that you might want to tweak is the saturation, which again also starts to make it look almost fake. If you go too far with it, it really starts to look like you've lost control. But you do want some saturation in this look because that helps pump it up. As I said, street photography is a pretty pumped up, aggressive look. As you look at this photo, you can see the yellows are very bright. The man's pants are almost solid black. The car here, the black car, doesn't have hardly any detail on it. The woman's black hair is pretty much of a solid shape. The woman's black handbag doesn't have hardly any detail on it. But the pink in the dress, the red in the handbag, the yellow of the flowers, even the red back here in the door and the car in the background, and the blue on the sign, the colors really pop. And that's the look that you'll see here in most of these. They're really exploiting the contrast, and they're really exploiting the brightness of the color. So this is saturation, and what saturation means is that the color doesn't have very much of a neutral blended with it. So if you have a pot of red paint and some black paint and you blend that black paint with it, it's going to become less saturated. The same thing's true if you have a can of red paint and a can of white paint. Take that white paint and start mixing it in. It's going to become a softer color, eventually kind of pink. There's more neutral blended in, it tends to look softer. And in the street photography style, soft is not what we're looking for. So just to show you again, if I crank down the saturation far enough, eventually it'll start to turn black and white. It'll lose any color. So that's a look that's interesting, and some people like to explore it, but in general, the standard street photography look is pretty high contrast, throw in a bit of brightness, turn up the saturation until it starts to look just too much. So that's standard, that's the way the photo was shot in camera. Just adding a little bit, about 25, 30% more color. And now I've got something that really starts to look like the kind of look for the color street photography style. Let's look at the black and white for a minute. So black and white is actually the same basic concept. It's a very high contrast, very prominent lights and dark darks. See that here in this photo with the lines. But almost all of these, the blacks are very black, and the whites are sometimes even almost too washed out. For example, here we have practically nothing in the sky but film grain. Here the sky is just whited out, and we have very dark blacks along the side. So let's see how we can do that. So let's turn this photo, I'm going to revert back to the original, let's turn this photo into black and white. And in photos you have a black and white tool that you can use, and you can hit the auto button to find what the application would recommend. The intensity is going to determine how much, how rich the dark is. Tone will create an effect a lot like contrast. So again, we want to give it an edge in this style. Turn up the whites. This is going to be a little farther over the edge than most people would think of because, again, editorial fashion, journalism, you want to preserve the detail in the lights and the darks. If I turn up the neutrals to the point where those bricks or blocks in the wall just basically go away, that's a little too far, but in the street photography style, we would probably push this to be more extreme than we would if we were doing something for journalism. I wanted to show you another website before we go. Let's see if I can find it. It has to do with what's called crushing the blacks or crushing the whites. So on this webpage by Kurt Palm, he's talking about crushing the blacks and whites in a video context, and it's really important in video, but it applies exactly the same way in still photography. So here we have a photo of a woman in a snow environment, a snow background, which tends to create a very high contrast situation. So here we've crushed the whites by accentuating the brightness too much, and so you can see how there actually was some detail in the snow behind her, but in the situation where the whites are crushed, you end up losing all the detail of the background, and her skin looks pretty bright. And then down here, where we're crushing the blacks, you're seeing more detail in the snow, which is kind of nice, but you don't see anywhere near as much detail in her hair, and her clothing, her skirt loses, and her purse lose any detail at all. I mean, they just become black blobs. So you want to try and find a spot where you're not crushing the blacks and whites, but you're going pretty far with it. So we're still seeing a little bit of the draping in the woman's pants here, just a little bit. And we still do see some of the blocks in the white building behind. So we haven't gone too far, but we want to try to go as far as we can in order to get a very aggressive, edgy, very brilliant, very bold look for our street photography style. So this is optional. You don't have to do this, but I think that you'll enjoy experimenting with the black and white settings and the color, brightness, contrast, and saturation settings for your street photography. One more thing before I go, I'm going to revert this back to original. If you're using the Windows machine, the built-in photo app in Windows 10, I don't think it has a black and white. It might, but some of the editors you have might not have a black and white separate setting. So in order to go black and white with a color photo, just turn the saturation all the way down, and then you can use the brightness and contrast just like you would if it was a color photo. Just turn the saturation down to remove the color, and that'll get you into the black and white territory, and then just use brightness and contrast to give it that high dynamic range, high dynamic look. Okay, great. That's it for today. Thanks. See you. Bye.